Hi, I'm Michael Hirsh, one of the founders of Nelvana, Cookie Jar, and WoW Unlimited Media, one of the builders of the Canadian animation industry. And this is True North Country Comics podcast.
Welcome to the True North Country Comics podcast, dedicated to promote Canadian comic book and graphic novel creators and supporters. I'm John Swinimer. On this episode, I chat with Michael Hirsh about his autobio book, Animation Nation, from Sutherland House Publishing. Please like and subscribe to this website by hitting the subscribe button, so you'll be notified about new podcast interviews and article posts. This podcast is available wherever podcasts are enjoyed. Please like, follow, and subscribe. Michael Hirsh is a Belgian-born Canadian animation producer, TV executive, entrepreneur, and author. He's been attributed to building from the ground up the Canadian animation industry, and more specifically, award-winning children's programming since the 1980s. He co-founded Nelvana, a Canadian-based animation and entertainment studio in 1971 with partners Patrick Loubert and previous podcast guest Clive A. Smith, producing numerous cartoons that established Nelvana as a leader in the industry, including Little Bear, Franklin, Babar, Max and Ruby, The Magic School Bus, Care Bears, The Adventures of Tintin, Inspector Gadget, Droids, and Ewoks, among many, many others. After Corus Entertainment's acquisition of Nelvana, Michael continued work in the animation industry as CEO of Cookie Jar Group, eventually acquired by DHX Media, now WildBrain, and then went on to be CEO and chairman of WoW Unlimited Media until December 2023. Animation Nation, How We Built a Cartoon Empire, outlines how Michael and his various teams became the driving force behind Canada's animation dominance. Animation Nation is his behind-the-scenes account of working with such famous cartoon franchises that people love and enjoy. He's worked with larger-than-life personalities including Roseanne Barr, Mr. T, Deborah Harry, Tim Burton, and George Lucas. Packed with humor and hard-won wisdom, Animation Nation is a frame-by-frame account of how creative talent and entrepreneurial zeal built a global cartoon empire. So, without further ado, here's my chat with Michael Hirsh about his autobio book, Animation Nation, from Sutherland House Publishing. So, Michael Hirsh, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me.
Listen, it's my pleasure, John. Happy to talk to you.
Well, it's my pleasure too, because looking at your resume of work, you've been entertaining not only myself, but my family and many others listening for many, many years. So thank you for that right off the bat. But before I get going with all the questions, I would like to know, what was the first comic book that you read?
It's a good question. I was an early comic book reader, so I would have read, Superman and the sort of Disney comics, the Archie comics. I can't remember the very first one. Probably my reading of comics really started probably with comic strips. So reading what was in the Toronto newspapers. I was in Toronto as a young kid, so read everything from Peanuts to Gasoline Alley to Maggie and Jigs, bringing up Father, or whatever it was called. Lots and lots and lots of comics. Mandrake the Magician, Little Abner were some of my favorites.
Oh, yeah, lots of good stuff. And unfortunately, it's literally a lost art these days, because a lot of people growing up would wait for the Sunday newspaper to come in and devour it for that. Say, give me the funnies. I want to read that first. So, yeah, lots of good stuff. But you're an animator at heart, and we're going to get to your book in a second. But just before I get to that, I wanted to ask about influences that inspired you to get into the animation business. Was there any sort of one or two animation projects that you said, yes, that's what I want to do in life?
Yeah, so before, I decided to do it as a profession, as a young kid, I would go to the movies. And this is, I was growing up in the 50s. And, my neighborhood movie theater had double bills. And there was another theater I could walk to that was triple bills. The double bill theater would always have lots of animated shorts, so Warner Brother cartoons, Looney Tunes, with Porky Pig and Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny, those types of cartoons, as well as the Disney cartoons with Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, those characters. I fell in love with animation at that stage, kept watching it on TV as a kid, loved Boris, and Natasha from Rocky and Bullwinkle, and watched Cap and Kangaroo with Tom Terrific and the Filmfare cartoons they ran. So I was really, fully engaged watching lots of movies and TV shows. When I started my career as really an experimental filmmaker, so I started making films in high school and kept doing that in college. When I was in my last year of college, a friend asked me if I could put together a team of people and he would train us to do plasticine animation because he had a contract from Jim Henson to deliver 5 letters for Sesame Street. And this was the first season of Sesame Street. And he asked me if I could put together a team. I said yes, and put together a group that included Patrick Loubert, who later became one of my partners with Clive in Nelvana. We did the 5 letters for Sesame Street. Interestingly, at least 3 of those letters are still on YouTube. It's always amazing that it's, where old productions go to die, the graveyard. Essentially, we enjoyed the experience and thought, well, we could, make a successful company that did this. And I went back to my friend and asked him if he wanted to continue doing this. And we'd go out and get contracts for commercials or show openings and programs. And my friend said, no, he had a job and didn't really want to do it. He was just trying to help his friend Jim Henson with delivering these shorts. So that's kind of how I got my first entree into animation, beginning with a great show, Sesame Street, and then Nelvana was really born out of that effort.
Wow. Yeah, that's tremendous. Let's get to your book next. This is something I missed when it came out, and I think it's something that everyone should read. It's called Animation Nation, How We Built a Cartoon Empire. So maybe you could just give a elevator pitch about the book itself. I know it's tough because it's literally your career and we could spend hours and hours talking about it, but maybe essentially what were you trying to get out of it? Because there's lots in there. Like you could just dig in there for hours, but what was your intent in getting the book out?
Yeah, so I've had an interest in sort of making sure that history gets told and doesn't get lost. And that really started before this book with the first book I did, which was called The Great Canadian Comics, which I did with Patrick Loubert. And what happened was, after we did these Sesame Street shorts, or actually when we were doing them, I was doing some freelance work for CBC and magazines. And I came across a story about comic books that had been published in Canada during World War II. Through my research, I found John Ezrin, who was the owner of the archives and owned the underlying rights and had preserved whatever original artwork still existed, the printing plates, contracts, etc. And so I told that story and told it in the book, The Great Canadian Comics. We also did a documentary for CBC Telescope that was a primetime documentary of the same title. And we interviewed some of the artists and showed people the different kind of comics that were done and brought some of them to life in animatic form. We also did a traveling show with the original artwork for the National Gallery of Canada that toured Canada. And at the end of the project, we basically found a home for the original artwork and complete sets of the comics in the Museum of Man, which later became the Museum of Civilization in Ottawa. And we did that to preserve the history. At the time, George Henderson, who ran a comic book store in Markham Village, wanted us to, let him sell the artwork piece by piece, but we wanted to preserve the history. That has turned out to be a good decision because people have been able to reprint the comics from that material. They've been able to do other additional histories of Canadian comics, like Heroes of the Home. I think it's called Heroes from the Home Front.
That's it exactly, yeah, by Ivan Kochmarek. I've interviewed him for this podcast.
Ivan became a great reteller of the history and did a lot more research and continued the good work that we had started. Hope Nicholson reprinted the Nelvana comics. And essentially, that experience with the Great Canadian Comics stayed with me. And then the next book that we did was after Nelvana's 25th anniversary, or maybe it was the 30th anniversary, we decided to do a history of Nelvana because we had just sold the company to Corus Broadcasting Group that had the most channels for kids. We wanted to make sure that the Nelvana history didn't get lost. So basically, we did that book, and it was written by Danny Stoffman, who was a terrific business writer in Toronto at the time. Animation Nation, which is the book that I did this past year, tells the story of the building of the animation industry in Canada. So it goes beyond the Nelvana story and then continues my career after that with the building of Cookie Jar and later WOW Unlimited Media. And so essentially it brings the story up to date with my experience and takes us into modern times. And in Canada, we built this fantastic animation industry that we're one of the top animation countries in the world.
It's amazing. It's a page turner, and everything that's on the page, you go, yes, I remember that. I remember that. But you start off, and I don't want to spoil anything, but you start right off the bat with something that Star Wars fans are just gaga over. And in fact, it was sort of the highlight of the criticized Star Wars Holiday Special, where you first introduced Boba Fett and the Mandalorians in general. And that's a great story in itself. I don't want to give too much away, but it's really tremendous, the fact that this sort of was an inspiration that spurred what your work was, but also the viewers who were watching it too. The imaginations were just lit up when this happened. So first, I got to thank you for that. And maybe you could just sort of reminisce a little bit about that experience.
Sure. So the Star Wars Holiday Special was an exciting moment in Nelvana's history. We had just produced A Cosmic Christmas, which was our first fully animated half-hour special, and it was obviously a Christmas special that had a sci-fi theme. About a month after it aired, I got a call from Lucasfilm asking me if, we were the Nelvana that had, produced A Cosmic Christmas, and I affirmed that we were, and they invited me to come and meet with George Lucas in his studio in Marin County, just outside of San Francisco. So I embarked on a journey, and it was a difficult journey for me and for the company because at the time, we were a company without capital. We didn't have much money. We had one credit card in the whole company, which limited, types of hotels you could stay at, et cetera. It was a very restrictive sort of situation. So I flew out with the company's hopes and wishes, ended up meeting with George, and we had a meeting of the minds right away. Clive Smith and Patrick Loubert, who were my partners in Nelvana, we had discussed what was the best way to adapt the Star Wars material into animation. And we decided that the French artist Mobius had an art style that would lend itself well to doing this for a 10-minute short. And so George agreed. We got to work on it right away. It was a great experience for us because not only did we get to work with George Lucas, who was a great creative person, but we worked with Ben Bird, who was his sound designer. We worked with Joe Johnson, who was one of his designers, and a lot of his staff, all of whom were the best at what they did. And at the time, there was no film industry in Canada, so we were sort of creating our studio and figuring out how to move it ahead creatively on our own. Working with Lucasfilm helped us sort of achieve a lot more quickly, grow a lot more quickly. And George became a mentor. And as we began to develop our first animated movie, Rock and Rule, Lucas gave us advice along the way and introduced us to people who might be helpful. And all in all, it was a great leap forward for this little studio from Toronto in a country that didn't have an animation industry or a film or television industry at the time. It stood us in good stead.
Yeah, it's tremendous. And I'm glad that you started off the book with that. As I said, every page has a little bit of something that people can relate to and little tidbits and things that you piece together going, oh, that's what happened. So appreciate you sharing that. I'd like to sort of turn the tables a little bit and talk about the creative process. Now, I'm sure the tools changed over the various years through your career about, we got to digital tools and stuff like that. But I want to just really dig into the creation process. If you could maybe walk me through the first step for creators who are listening here and I've talked to, typically it comes up with an idea. Is that basically it? You sit around a table, flesh out an idea, and then you start the storyboarding? Or maybe you could just talk about that a little bit.
Over time, the process for creative development has changed and evolved. And a lot of it has to do with the platform that you're going to, be showing your program on. So back when we were doing A Cosmic Christmas and Star Wars, and we were just starting out as an animation studio, in those days, it was very expensive. It was to do an animated special was probably close to $1 million Canadian, even back in mid 70s. So you couldn't just do it unless you were very wealthy, and we weren't. So you had to basically sell the show to a network. And in the case of our first show, Cosmic Christmas, and the next 5 specials we did, we pre-sold them to CBC and Radio Canada. And we found a distributor through A Cosmic Christmas in the US who took the US and the rest of the world. And so they invested in the show. And between the two investments, we were able to fund the shows. The development to get them to the point where we would get the funding was largely developing a script and a design look. And that was what we had to do in that period. As time went on, it became more complicated because we moved into movies and series. So with movies, when we did Rock and Rule, we could fund it by selling shares in the movie to investors, and there were tax shelters in Canada at the time. And so, again, you had to develop the project so that you could convince people to invest in it. And when it came to TV series, you had to pre-sell it to networks, and the only networks that really could afford to do an animated show at that time were the US networks. And one of the benefits we gained from doing the Star Wars cartoon with George Lucas was we became network acceptable because Lucas had sort of anointed us and let us work on his CBS special. So that gave us a major leg up in that field. But again, you had to go in and pitch the projects, and you had to sell in that, number one, it was going to be a successful show because everything was ratings driven. And at the same time, you also had to come in with great creative, and people had to believe in your ability to deliver. At the time, there weren't that many animation production companies that were acceptable to the U.S. networks, and we were the only Canadian company at the time, and we were acceptable to all of the networks and worked with them all eventually. And then as time has evolved, and if we go forward to the period we're in now, you can still do that, but instead of the networks, you really have to go and sell streamers. So Netflix, Disney Plus, Paramount Plus, Peacock, any of the streamers, Apple, Amazon, they became the customers that you had to go and pre-sell. And the form of development was always the same, script and designs. And that would get you to the point where you could generally sell a show. Sometimes you had to do a sample of animation to show how you were going to make it exciting and bring it to life. Today, YouTube is now the place where more kids go to watch animation than any other place, and it's the most viewed channel, not only for kids, but for adults. So creators today have a different opportunity. They can actually make the shows, place them on YouTube, and build an audience by continuing to promote and drop new episodes and build a franchise. And if they're successful, the Netflixes and Amazons of the world will come calling, asking for a version for them. And there's a lot of examples of that. So the world is really totally changed. And it's a lot more like the world of independent filmmaking used to be when I first got started, where you'd make something on your own, you'd figure out how to fund it working with friends. It's really a DIY, a do-it-yourself culture that we're in now that is there alongside the professional premium version. But I think it's the way that most young people will develop their projects in the future and be successful.
Thanks for sharing that. Gosh, I don't know how to say this properly, but it's I'm going to sound like the kids don't know how lucky they have it today with all these digital tools. Because when you first started out, when you went into these first original pitch meetings and you said you had to have some sort of script, was it a fully baked script? And did you have to have all your character designs finished when you went into these meetings, or was it still kind of fluid?
You had to have a version done of the script, like a pilot script for a series or a movie script for the movie, and you basically had to have, your basic characters designed. You didn't have to have the whole thing designed, but you had to have enough of it for people to get comfortable that, yes, this was something that they thought people would want. Back in that time, you couldn't have done a project by yourself, and you made a good point that people have lots of digital tools available to them for free online. And so a young person today can do animation. They can put it on Roblox. They can put it on YouTube. They can put it anywhere they want. And they do it without curation. We had to basically go sell the curators, the programmers, on what we were doing. And so it was a totally different environment than we're in today. And I think today's environment is a much more exciting one and is more fluid than what we had in the past. And I hope that young artists appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I ask because there are some similarities when I talk to creators of comic books, graphic novels, and animators too. Typically, they tell me that they need to come up with some sort of script first, and then they reach out to a collaborator, illustrator, and then they can sort of pitch ideas back and forth, and as it comes along, that comes together. Totally different from your experience where you had to go in there and literally say, okay, imagine this and imagine that as a fully formed idea. So comic books are slightly a little more looser, I guess, in scope, whereas animation, especially back when you're first pitching, was a little bit tighter, and you had to know exactly what you're going in for and how to convey that idea to the people that you wanted to invest in your work, I suppose.
Yes, and I think one of the drivers for that distinction between animation and comic books is that the production of a comic book is much less expensive than the production of an animated film or an animated TV episode. Even today, a TV episode, will generally cost around $500,000 to $600,000 per half hour, and a half hour is really only 20 minutes. And movies cost anywhere from a few $1 million to hundreds of millions of dollars. But even the few $1 million is a lot of money. Comic books can be done in the tens of thousands of dollars. So it's a totally different order of capital that's required. One of the other big differences is back in my day, you had to have an animation studio to make animation because there weren't that many people who were trained. Over the years, there's been a proliferation of animation schools. The first one in Canada was Sheridan College, and it soon became kind of the Harvard to Cal Arts, which was the other major animation school in LA, to their Yale, so to speak, or Oxford to Cambridge. So, and today Sheridan still remains one of the most successful and popular animation schools. But we have many more. We have animation being done at OCAD in Toronto, Seneca, Humber, schools all over the country, and schools all over the world that are generating a lot of animators. So if you go back to the time when there weren't that many animators, you had to keep them busy going from project to project, or they would move to where the work existed. So they were nomadic. That basically led to us having to grow Nelvana, my first animation company, and make sure that we always had projects that we could keep people employed and keep our talent together.
Right. Very important. Now, we could be here all night and all day talking about your different projects, but maybe I could just hone in on one because I think there's a relevance here. You were born in Belgium, and Tintin was one of your inspirations, I guess. Maybe you could talk just very briefly about why Tintin was an important project for you.
Well, you hit the nail on the head. I responded in part because, I grew up knowing about Tintin, having been born in Belgium and French being my first language. We had done Babar with Canal Plus, which was the largest broadcaster in France, or the largest important broadcaster, and they picked up the rights to Tintin and asked us to co-produce that with them. And we had built a studio together while we worked on Babar, which was called Le Studio Ellipse in Paris. And we basically did Tintin together. And it was a lot harder for us to get it financed on our side of the co-production, because Tintin was obviously one of the most important French properties around. But we were able to get, at the time, Family Channel in Canada to buy the show. We were able to sell it to HBO in the US, and they had been our supporter on Babar as well. We essentially began to focus on these projects that we could co-produce with Europe, and it gave us an alternative way to keep the studio busy, because we had our US network business where we were doing Care Bears and My Pet Monsters at the time, and the Beetlejuice series, and obviously Ewoks and Droids for Lucasfilm. But the co-productions created another wave so that if there weren't as many network shows that year, we had our international co-productions that kept the studio together.
That's great. I ask that because whenever I ask creators about their inspirations growing up, 9 times out of 10, people mention Tintin or Asterix. So it's really great that you've inspired people as well with the animated version. So that's tremendous. I know that you say at the very end of your book, you go through all the different things of no problem, but you get to retirement, and that is a problem. So I'm wondering, what's keeping you busy today besides talking to me? What are you up to these days?
Well, so part of what I'm doing is I am speaking at schools where they teach animation and filmmaking. So I'm doing a lot of public speaking. I'm speaking at festivals. I was just at the Annecy Festival in France, which is the largest animation festival in the world, as a keynote speaker. But I'm also developing a comedy project with my friend Mark Breslin, who is the founder of Yuck Yucks and runs Yuck Yucks. And we're going to do a comedy project together. And I'm also busy working on acquiring yet another animation company. So I'm doing my best to fend off retirement.
Good for you. Good for you. So if people want to find out more about you and what you're up to these days, do you recommend that they go to any particular place online?
Yes. So I'm on LinkedIn and Instagram as Michael Hirsh Animation. And I recommend that they follow up on your response to my book and get it from either the publisher, Sutherland House, where they've got a website that you can order it. You can get it from Amazon. You can get it from indigo.com. The book, I think, is helpful to creators because I share a lot of the ups and downs that we went through in my various companies in terms of finding the right projects, developing them, and putting together the talent that made those projects so successful.
Thanks to Michael for the chat. You can discover more about Michael on Instagram at instagram.com/Michael Hirsh Animation. And you can discover more about the Animation Nation book from Sutherland House. Thank you for tuning in to the True North Country Comics podcast. I invite you to visit the True North Country Comics website to listen to even more conversations with creators about making comic books and graphic novels. I also encourage you to subscribe via the website so you'll be notified about new podcast interviews and article posts. This podcast is available wherever podcasts are enjoyed. Please like, follow, and subscribe. And you're welcome to follow True North Country Comics on most social media sites and send any and all feedback to John at truenorthcountrycomics.com. Thanks for tuning in, and come back soon for another episode. Bye for now. True North Country Comics Podcast is copyright True North Country Comics, copyright 2025.